Lion in the Wind. Chapter 10. Sergeant Welk stood by the door to the temporary troop barracks and stared blankly at the stars above him. "Which constellation are you studying?" came a voice next to him. This nearly made Welk leap out of his shoes. He turned to see Tegani staring off into the distance as the first thin threads of morning broke over the horizon. "Well, there goes that set of underwear. You do realize there's such a thing as being too quiet," said Welk. Tegani bowed slightly. "My apologies for frightening you," he said. "I'm glad you have the ability to move so silently. But please try not to sneak up on your own comrades like that. It could get you shot," said Welk. "I will make note of that," said Tegani. Welk took a deep breath and sighed. "How's your family doing?" he asked. "They're all right," replied Tegani. "Do they know you're gone?" Tegani nodded, but said nothing. Welk sighed slightly just as two men from his squad stepped out of the barracks. "Couldn't sleep either, eh?" he said to the two men. "I don't think any of us slept. For as much as I've trained for this day, the thought of actually going out there scares me senseless." "Are any of the others awake?" asked Welk. "I think everyone is, except Corporal Dusty and Sergeant Sims." Welk chuckled. "It figures. Those two could sleep through the end of the world and not flinch. Well, either way, tell everyone who's awake to get down to the chow hall and get something to eat. Make sure they know to be back here by 0700. If anyone's still asleep by then, we'll kick them out of bed and feed them a portable ration along the way. The train will be here at 0800 sharp to pick us up, so we need to be there on time. We don't want to miss it." "Yes, Sergeant," said the two men. They then turned and hurried back into the barracks. "Do we know where we'll be deployed?" asked Tegani. "From what the major told me, we're to report to an area that command believes will be the most contested, which means that things are going to get messy in a hurry. That's definitely not the place I want to be. But that's what our orders are, so that's what we'll have to deal with. Hopefully we won't all be killed in the first few minutes," said Welk. Tegani looked at Welk and said, "If Mashwa permits us to live, we will survive this battle." Welk nodded. "I hope you're right." Black looked up as Elgar strolled into his office. "Well, what good news do you bring?" "Is our trump card on his way?" he said gleefully. "The Lion and his team are heading to the front lines as expected. However, there appears to be a change of orders." Black waved dismissively. "Bah, that's to be expected." Elgar stared at Black grimly. "This is a change that may ruin our plans." "How so?" "The Lion and his team have been ordered to take up a position on the front lines in an area that is expected to see the heaviest fighting. The chances of their surviving the first day of battle under those conditions are slim, possibly non-existent at best." Black frowned. "What buffoon gave those orders?" he growled. "The document that our spies saw said that it was from the General Secretary. However, our analysis of the orders indicate that they were not given by him." Black leaned back in his chair and rubbed his chin in thought. "So if they're not from him, then who gave the orders?" "It could be a spy working for the Gorg," said Elgar. "Or a competitor. It wouldn't be difficult to believe that they'd do such a thing. It'd take considerable work, planning, and penetration of the intelligence networks to pull it off, but it could still be done. The only question is, who would be selfish enough to risk the future of our entire country just to get back at me?" said Black thoughtfully. "I don't think it was a competitor. None of them would be that foolish. Which means it has to be the work of a double agent." Black scratched his chin in thought. "Yes, it could be. But we can figure that out later. Right now we need to protect our investment. That's our most pressing issue at the moment." Elgar cocked his head curiously. "What would you have me do?" he asked. "Gather together our best field teams. I want them watching over and protecting that Lion day and night. It's already bad enough that he's in the worst part of the lines. To have him killed, and his body captured by the Gorg, will put us in a situation that I don't care to tender at this moment." Elgar bowed. "I will make sure that he is kept as safe as our men are capable of doing." Good. And while you're at it, see if you can't find out who is behind this order. I would like to deal with them personally. Elgar nodded. I'll see what I can find. Welk and his men surveyed the rally camp with concern. Not a lot of men here, said Welk. Do you think they're on the line already? Asked Sims. Welk shrugged. If they're not, we're in worse shape than I thought. He then picked up his field pack and said, All right everyone, grab your gear and let's find out where we're supposed to be. The squad obeyed and then followed Welk through the camp to one of the administration tents. They were soon loaded onto a truck and sent bouncing down a rutted dirt road towards a long, thin line of men and vehicles positioned just over a mile from the border. If this is all they have to hold the line, we're going to be in some serious trouble, said Welk. Do you think they'll reinforce us? Asked Dusty. Hard to say. Given what we saw back at the rally camp, that likely won't happen. Dusty rolled his eyes. Lovely. I always wanted to be a speed bump, he said sarcastically. The trucks soon stopped near the front and all the men piled out. Welk's small squad quickly found their place on the line, and were comfortably dug in before nightfall. The following morning the men awoke hungry, thirsty and damp from the morning dew, but still tense and nervous. Dusty pulled a piece of dried meat from his pocket and chewed noisily on it as he studied the simple barbed wire fence that marked the border between Gorg and Yigzin territory. The fence was flanked on one side by a thick forest of trees, while the other was open, grass-covered prairie. Do you think they know we're here? Asked Dusty. Given our current activity along the border, I'd be surprised if they didn't, said Sims. Hey, heads up, shouted Welk. The men turned and spotted him walking towards them with 2 canvas bags full of green cans. He set the bags down and tossed one can to each man. Dusty looked curiously at the can and asked, What's this? Cancatter, said Welk. Oh man. That's gonna be nasty, said one of the men. Sims cracked his open and took a sip. He grimaced slightly and spit out the strong black liquid. How does it taste? Asked one of the men. Like sewage, said Sims. In other words, it's typical military catter, quipped Dusty. Sims tossed the can to the side, its contents spilling out on the ground. The others looked at their cans and then tossed theirs aside without opening them. Score 1 for Army catter, quipped one of the men. Dusty looked at Tegani and asked, Do you want some cancatter? I know it tastes nasty to us, but I don't think that'll bother you. Tegani shook his head. I am unable to consume food or liquids. I have no way to digest or process them. One of the men chuckled. Lucky dog. He doesn't have to worry about going hungry or thirsty like the rest of us do. Or getting old and fat, chided another. He should be thankful. He can't be forced to eat your mother's cooking, chided a third. Hey, my mom makes great food, said the second. Could have fooled me, skinny boy. Tegani listened with passive interest as the men bantered playfully back and forth in an effort to alleviate their boredom and suppress their growing fear. As he did, his ears detected a strange sound in the distance. It was high-pitched and sounded like the buzzing of angry bees. His ears turned back and forth in search of the source of the sound. Now it was above him. He looked up and scanned the sky anxiously for several moments and then spotted hundreds of little black pinpoints falling quickly towards him. He studied them curiously, trying to make sense of what he was seeing, and then suddenly realized what they were. He immediately turned to his squad members and shouted, Incoming! The men looked up in surprise as the lion dove into a foxhole, dragging Dusty and another soldier with him. Momentarily confused, Welk turned to Tegani and then stopped in surprise as a whistling sound quickly filled his ears. He swore. Incoming! Incoming! Take cover, he cried. The men soon heard the sound too and quickly ducked down into their foxholes as the first rounds began to fall. Soon the shells were falling in a thunderous rain of death that shook the ground and forced every soldier to cover his ears in agony. Tegani watched as the men in his squad stayed as low as they could in their foxholes, softly praying that none of the shells would land on them. He shifted his weight slightly as the ground shuddered under him. A glowing hot piece of shrapnel whistled by overhead. He carefully filtered out the thunderous, nearly continuous roar of exploding shells until they became nearly inaudible. Soon, all he could hear was the sounds of raining earth and men crying in fear. He chanced to look above the top of a foxhole and studied the area around him. The air was filled with a thick haze of dust, smoke and fire. Vehicles and equipment burned all along the line, the fires filling the sky with thick, black smoke that mixed with mushrooming, angry gray clouds of smoldering earth. What had been a bright and sunny summer day had quickly become the very essence of hell itself. Deciding it was safer to stay low, he slipped back down into the foxhole again. As he did, a large piece of shrapnel glanced off the edge of his foxhole, barely missing his head. Just then a set of new sounds began filling the air. His ears perked up slightly in interest. It was more artillery shells. But these sounded different and appeared to be traveling in the opposite direction. Within moments the bombardment slackened and then stopped completely. He waited anxiously for the shelling to resume. But it did not, despite a multitude of shells flying through the air overhead. He listened carefully for several moments longer and then realized what was happening. An artillery duel, he thought. Welk looked over at Tegani and then up at the sky as the air began to clear. "Is it over?" he asked. "For the moment. The Gorg are currently engaged in a duel with our artillery units. They will not shell us again until that battle has been decided," said Tegani. "How do you know that?" asked Welk. "I can both see and hear shells traveling overhead at high speed in both directions. I have also been intercepting radio chatter from our own forces, as well as those of the Gorg. The present flow of information from both sides appears to validate that assessment. So your communications system can do more than just talk with our portable radios," said Dusty. Tegani nodded. "I can interact with nearly every available communication system presently in existence." "That's impressive," replied Dusty. "Is it safe to come out?" asked one of the soldiers. "No, keep your head down," said Welk. The men lay curled up deep in their foxholes as they desperately clutched their rifles. Dirt and grass covered every inch of their bodies in a thick gray mat of grime and filth. They nervously eyed each other as they listened to the anguished cries of wounded men all around them. "Head check." "Is anybody hurt?" shouted Dusty. The men examined themselves and then each other. While no one was hurt, many of them were visibly shaken and their ears ached. Just then a medic scurried up to their foxholes. "Anyone in here hurt?" he asked as he tried to adjust his helmet. "We're fine, just kinda shaken," said Welk. "There are people in a foxhole 10 meters to the north of here who need aid," said Tegani. The medic was surprised to see this. "Hey, you're that talking lion that I've heard so much about. That's kinda cool." "I didn't think you were real," said the medic. "Get moving, medic." "Those men need your help," said Welk. "Yes, Sergeant," replied the medic. He then scurried off in search of the wounded. The men flinched briefly as several stray artillery shells exploded nearby. "Stuff's still falling. We should be careful," said Sims. Just then Tegani stiffened. His head immediately spun around as he focused all of his senses towards the distant tree line. He spotted it almost at the same time the others did. "Contact!" cried Welk. Others began repeating his warning down both sides of the line. Welk then turned and said, "Everyone, get ready." A moment later a wall of enemy troops and vehicles broke through the fence that marked the border between the two nations and charged at the Meter-Yigsen defensive line. "How many are there?" asked Dusty. "I count at least one armored battalion and one, possibly 2 regiments of infantry in our immediate area," said Tegani. Welk swore. "Looks like you were right, Dusty. We are going to be a speed bump today." Tegani studied the advancing Gorg troops and tried to decide what to do. He'd made a promise to his friends and family to protect the men with him at all costs. But he was beginning to doubt if he could do that. "The war started," said Visnel as he raced across the lab. "When?" asked Bergen in surprise. "About an hour ago." "Any word on how the battle is going?" Visnel shook his head. I don't know. There's a complete news blackout, and Major Delgra is staying very tight-lipped about what he knows. All they're telling anyone is that the fighting has started. Persia walked out of the office and stopped next to Bergen. When will we know anything? She asked. I don't know. I'm sure they'll tell us when they can, said Visnal. Persia looked at Bergen and asked, Dad, can we contact Tegani and see if he's all right? Bergen shook his head. He's probably busy right now. We don't want to interrupt him while he's trying to keep those men alive. Persia sighed and looked down at the ground. I'm worried about him, she said, pawing the ground anxiously. Bergen patted her on the head and then caressed her neck. We all are, sweetie. We all are. Dusty ducked down quickly, grabbing his helmet and drawing his rifle in close to his body as a rocket exploded in front of his foxhole, sending a spray of moist, black earth flying into the air and then down on top of him. He quickly popped back up and began firing again. Gorg fell one after another under a hail of accurate and devastating Yigzin fire. But there were so many of them pouring across the border that when one fell, another would quickly take their place. Bullets whizzed by Tegani's head, some tearing through his mane and others glancing off his armored body shell as he tried to get an assessment of the battle. Hold the line, shouted a nearby officer. Welk's squad fought on bravely, putting everything they had into the battle. Finally, unable to hold the line any longer, the order was given, and the Yigzin troops broke and quickly began retreating amidst heavy Gorg fire. Hearing the order, Welk turned to Dusty and Tegani, and said, All right, we're being pulled back. We need to give the others a chance to get clear before we get overrun. When I give the order, you two break out and head forward. Tegani, your orders are simple. If it moves and it's Gorg, kill it. Dusty, you guide him. Take any targets of opportunity and try to cause as much mayhem out there as you can. We'll cover you. Ready? Tegani and Dusty nodded. All right, here we go. Covering fire, shouted Welk. All of his men popped up out of their foxholes and began shooting rapidly into the Gorg lines. This caused the Gorg soldiers to break and scramble for cover. Go, shouted Welk as he changed magazines and began firing again. Dusty jumped onto Tegani's back and held on for dear life as they had practiced many times before. Tegani sprinted out of the foxhole at top speed, ran nearly 100 yards, and then deposited Dusty in a small patch of reed grass before continuing on. Dusty quickly got his bearings, and then began calling out targets. Like a blinding flash of gold, Tegani tore through the enemy troops like a whirlwind. Gorg soldiers fell like dominoes amid Tegani's ruthless onslaught. The Gorg tried frantically to kill him, but soon realized that their bullets had no effect. They quickly called for more firepower. A few minutes later a group of soldiers emerged from the line holding rocket launchers which they intended to use against him. Seeing this, Dusty informed Tegani of the situation, and then opened fire on the Rocketeers, dropping several of them in a row. This added to the mayhem and confusion as Gorg troops began firing on each other, unsure if some of their own had turned on them or if more enemy were in their midst. This had the desired effect of slowing the assault to a confused crawl, and then a dead stop. Everyone's clear. Pull back and get out of there, came Welk's voice over the radio. Dusty leapt up and began firing randomly into the Gorg lines. You heard him, Tegani. Pull back. Pull. Suddenly a bullet tore through his chest with a pop, knocking the wind out of him. He sank to his knees, dazed and confused, and then felt another round slice through him, followed by a third. Sensing that something was wrong, Tegani exploded out of the Gorg lines and into the open just in time to see another round penetrate Dusty's shoulder. He bolted at top speed towards him amid a withering hail of fire as Dusty collapsed to the ground. Tegani stopped next to him and disappeared into the grass as he studied his friend. Are you all right? He asked, a hint of fear in his voice. I feel funny, said Dusty, his eyes distant and confused. Can you climb onto my back? Asked Tegani. Dusty nodded weakly, and then awkwardly dragged himself onto the lion's back. Tegani carefully stood up and began running with all the speed he could manage towards the Yigzin lines while trying to keep Dusty on his back. He moved carefully back and forth through craters, around destroyed vehicles and through trenches until they were safely out of range of the Gorg. Tegani then took a more relaxed pace to make it easier on Dusty. He soon came across a platoon that was walking down the road in front of him. "Medic! I need a medic," shouted Tegani as he closed on the men. They turned around in surprise to see a wounded soldier struggling to hold onto the back of the Lion. They gasped as they saw thick trails of blood oozing down the brilliant golden fur of the Lion and onto the ground. A medic emerged from the group a moment later and ran over to Tegani. Quickly examining Dusty, he immediately got to work tending to Dusty's wounds as he shouted to the other men to help him. "Dusty, Tegani, are you on your way back?" came a voice over the radio. "Dusty's hurt," replied Tegani. "How bad?" Tegani studied Dusty and then the medic as he worked. "I don't know, but he's badly wounded." Dusty suddenly began convulsing wildly while gasping desperately for air. "Dusty!" shouted Tegani as fear echoed sharply in his voice. Dusty soon fell limp and died. The medic sighed and lowered his head in defeat. "No. Dusty. You can't die." "Dusty," said Tegani, the words rolling bitterly off his lips. He turned to his right, looked in the direction of the approaching Gorg, and then down at Dusty. His eyes narrowed as a soft growl rumbled from his lips. He turned to his right, and said, "Take care of my friend. I have something I need to do." "But," said the medic just as Tegani bolted off towards the front. Several moments later Welk, and two of his men, came running down the road asking if anyone had seen a Lion in the area. They were pointed towards two medics who were putting a soldier onto a stretcher. When they arrived they quickly recognized who it was, and gasped. "By the ancients," said one of the soldiers. "Corporal, have you seen a talking lion anywhere around here?" asked Welk. One of the medics looked up from his work and nodded. "Yeah, strangest thing I've ever seen," he said. "Where'd he go?" asked Welk. The medic pointed towards the front lines. "He went off that way. Said he had something to do." Welk tapped his transmitter and said, "Tegani, come in. Tegani. Respond if you hear me." But only static greeted his pleadings. "He's not responding. We need to go see if he's all right. Private, go back and tell the others to find a place along the second defensive line and wait for us. Sergeant Sims, you're with me." The men then separated and headed their respective ways. As Welk hurried down the road through the gradually thinning trickle of retreating soldiers, he repeatedly tried to raise Tegani on the radio, but with no luck. He swore, "You better not be dead, Tegani, or so help me."